Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining. I really appreciate that when I give this talk that people are actually interested and want to show up. So thanks so much for coming. Started off. So I'm dyslexic, and that's really the inspiration behind this presentation and what's really gotten me started thinking about this and really passionate about it. Just in case anybody doesn't know. Dyslexia is a brain-based condition that affects people's ability to work with words, numbers, and symbols. It makes reading hard, it can make spelling hard, it can make math hard, and it presents everyone who's dyslexic has a very different experience with the learning disability. So it can be very mild or it can be very severe. It is not something that you grow out of. So I get that question a lot when I do this with this talk, particularly with people that aren't very familiar with it. They think it's something that maybe appears in childhood and goes away with time. It does not. Another common question that I get and sort of a misconception about dyslexia is that it's just words sort of flipping around on a page, sort of like a dizzy spell. You can Google it. There's a lot of different simulators that sort of show text moving around on a page, and they call them dyslexia simulators. While it's sort of, it's a good metaphor for what dyslexia, sort of this disorientation that dyslexia can bring someone while reading, but it's not necessarily the actual symptom of it. So, as I look at this slide right now, letters are not actively moving around the page. It's not like I'm dizzy or like a motion graphic at all. This talk isn't specifically about dyslexia, though. It's about a concept called neurodiversity. So neurodiversity recognizes neurotype or neurological differences and respects them like any other human variation. It can include so many different types of learning disabilities or disorders or differences or a range in cognitive ability. It's sort of taken off recently. About 2 or 3 years ago, there was a very viral video from a company called Now This, which makes science content online that talks about neurodiversity and really the neurodiversity movement in our culture today. And so I'm just curious, before I told you about it, how many people have heard of neurodiversity or has been aware of neurodiversity? Just gonna let people chime in for a second. Cool, so it looks like a majority of people had before, which is really great. I started doing this talk about 2 years ago, and I always ask for a raise of hands or do a poll, and it has gone up over time, which I really like to see. Just to get a little bit more detailed, this is a more detailed list of different types of experiences or different differences that might include you in neurodiversity. This is also not a comprehensive list by any means. It's an umbrella term that is meant to be very inclusive of anyone who feels like they might need to be included in this. Also, some of these differences can be diagnosed, and some of them are still being studied today and don't necessarily have formal diagnoses like ADHD does. And so there's a lot of work right now being done to formalize a lot of these different experiences and ways our brains work. So why should you care? I get this question a lot, particularly if I'm working with a client or talking to a group of people that want to know why this would be important to start designing for, why this might be important for their product or for their business. And there's a lot of different studies out there that sort of have done in research on how many of us might be included in this bucket, and it's estimated that around 34% of people are considered to be neurodiverse. This statistic comes from studies and analysis done of kids who are diagnosed with different learning disabilities at public schools. So obviously this number can fluctuate. It doesn't include a lot of different types of education systems, but it's estimated that around 34% of people experience some sort of range of neurodiversity. And I think that's a really powerful number, especially if you're at the point where you're trying to make your product or service more inclusive, being able to boost your metrics by 34% in any metric or any type of thing you might want to measure would be a really powerful change. I also want to talk about a movement that's been happening in design, but also in technology, of diversity and inclusion. I think this work is incredible, and I love that it's become such a table stakes topic in our industry now. And there's whole teams of people at companies that are working on being more diverse and more inclusive. But I don't see, I see more now than ever, but I still don't see a ton of people including neurodiversity or neurotype in their diversity and inclusion efforts. I think, it's something that neurotype affects everybody, and it's very inclusive, a way to be very inclusive. And so I'd like to see it show up in diversity and inclusion efforts even more. Another one that's a little bit more appropriate for, I think, like web design or designing digital products is accessibility. I see a lot of really interesting work being done to help people who maybe are vision impaired, use devices like iPhones today, or people that are hearing impaired. Also a lot of work with people that might have motor issues with their hands. They can't use touch screens as well as other people. But I don't see sort of neurodiversity included in accessibility efforts. I think one reason is because it's a little harder to design for. It's a little harder to measure the results of, because it's such a broad term. Something like color blindness, it's really easy to do some contrast testing and figure out that your site holds up for different types of color blindness, but it's a lot harder to sort of figure out if your product holds up for the range of neurotypes that people have. So I think it's definitely a place where we can start talking about this even more. I want to get in, that was a lot of context, and thank you for letting me sort of go on my spiel about neurodiversity and the context and sort of how I see it placed in our industry today. I want to get specifically into more methods that you can use, some tips or activities, things to prioritize when you're actually building digital products, and how you can make them more inclusive and appeal to a wider audience, or a neurodiverse audience. So the first one is understanding people beyond their personas. Personas are a super popular user research method, and I'm curious who uses personas at their company, or who has personas or has made them before. Just letting the poll results come in for a second. Cool, so it looks like a big majority of you have used them before, which is really great. Typically a persona consists of like demographic data. It will give a name and a face to your user, and it also will summarize them, right? So you'll take a lot of user research data and sort of summarize them into one persona. I've heard a lot of people call them design stereotypes before, and I think they're really great, particularly if you're trying to sort of express the value of user research to like a business team, a sales team, or a marketing team. I think it can really bridge that gap between design thinking and business really well. The problem that I have with personas right now, or the more traditional way of making them, is that they are, they are sort of stereotypes and can be a little bit exclusive or exclude different types of people. And so one way that I like to run personas is a little bit of a higher level way to think about it. So instead of including things like age, or including things like what device they might use, or sort of like likes and dislikes that a group of users might have, I like to do what we call the 3 M's, which are mind frames, missions, and methods. So mind frames you can think of as thoughts and feelings, right? So how is your user, what are the problems they have, and how do they feel about them, and what do they think about them? Missions are goals or objectives that your user has. So what do they need to accomplish? How are the problems that they're having, or the thoughts and the feelings that they're having in mind frames, affect the things they need to do every day? And then methods can be, you can do it 2 ways depending on sort of what stage in your design process you are. One way to do them is to brainstorm sort of solutions. You can do solutioning or brainstorming built right into a persona, which I think is really fun. Another way methods can be used is workarounds. So how are they solving their problems now? And you can get a really good sense of complex processes your user group is doing. And I think removing demographic data, removing what devices they're using, or these sort of like more metric type of personas, these personas that have a lot of metrics on them, can help you think more holistically about a range of people and how they work. Another much simpler version of a persona, or in addition to sort of the metrics-based persona that you can use, is a thinking, hearing, feeling, seeing diagram. I really like these. I think it really gets to the heart of the person you're talking about and the problems they're having. And so I like to put a scenario on these. So you can say, if, let's use like a banking app, for example, if somebody's opening their banking app to check their balance, what are they thinking? What are they feeling? And then what are they sort of hearing from the world, and what are they seeing on your application that might influence how they behave, or the experience they have with your application at the same time. Cool. So the second method that I want to talk about is forgiveness. This is a much higher level concept in design, and one that I think we can all remember a little bit more. So the idea, this is Grammarly, which is a spell checking, sort of grammar correcting product that I really, really love. Is so useful to me. But they really forgive their users, right? So this concept is, I'll go back to the slide so you guys don't have to watch the video a million times, but the idea is that you're going to create a system, and that system is going to be very complex. And if you do not forgive your users for making a mistake inside of your system, it's going to be a lot more frustrating for them and make it a lot harder for them to use, and exclude a lot of people who might have a hard time digesting the data or the information that you're showing them. So this example of Grammarly is really great because they're much, they sort of optimize for forgiveness. They're much more forgiving than something like Google Docs, which helps you a little bit if you make a writing mistake, but not to this extent. Grammarly really gets very detailed and deep and helps you accomplish goals and also just correct errors. And so I think this is a great example of a product that has optimized for and prioritized a use case around forgiveness, right? Like forgiving someone writing, making mistakes, and optimizing for helping them solve it. So I think as you think about your system, if there's not a way to undo, or not a way to help users if they make a mistake, or do something maybe not optimal, I encourage you guys to think about how to prioritize a way to forgive them and help them correct their mistakes without it feeling, like a big error appears. The third example I want to go through is prioritizing edge cases. So this is one I include particularly for product and design people who are creating an MVP, which is a lot of the work that I do at Carbon 5 revolves around creating and launching MVPs very rapidly. When you are doing that, often you prioritize sort of the core features and you leave out things that you might not, might be hard to develop or might seem like details. And when you do that, I think it can be fairly an exclusionary process. So I think this is a really helpful diagram to show, an MVP might help these 4 users accomplish their goals really well, but it won't necessarily help the extreme users on either side of this bell curve accomplish their tasks. You're not always going to be able to prioritize edge cases based on like resources and budget and timeline. It's a really hard thing to get done or to advocate for. I think as a designer, how I try to prioritize them and how I try to include them is to find ways to incorporate them into a flow or a workflow that doesn't make them an addition, but makes them a core part of the process. So that goes back to the concept of forgiveness that I was talking about. If you learn about an edge case through user research, I think it's a lot more powerful to just propose a solution that includes that edge case rather than making a flow and then making another one that includes the edge case. If you can just sort of scope your work to include it, even if once you go through a design review or a product review, it might get scoped down. I think just making it a part of your initial proposal and not even necessarily calling out that it is an edge case is really powerful. It just automatically puts it at the front of everyone's mind that this is something that design feels will make the user experience much better. And I think that's a great first step in the door. And then, a lot of constraints will be put on your work after that. But if you can just get it started with the design work, I think that's a really powerful way to get it included in the scope immediately. So my fourth method is just understanding good examples. So thinking about sort of like inclusive personas, forgiveness, and edge cases, I've come up with a couple companies that I think are really doing a good job. And as you're using different products and services, digital products and services throughout your day, I think you can start to notice maybe who is being a little more inclusive to neurodiversity by default. Maybe they don't even mean to. This is my short list. I showed you guys Grammarly already. Duolingo, I know a lot of people are starting to use this now that we're all at home more, but their curriculum is really amazing. They offer a ton of different inputs to show that you've mastered different languages. One of my favorite ones is that they actually have a speaking portion, so you can speak into your phone and they analyze your speech and say if you've sort of mastered the vocabulary or not, which I think is really powerful. They also offer abilities to skip different types of inputting content. So I see a lot of, when I'm using it, there's a lot of spelling ones that I'm allowed to skip and they'll replace it with a different type of input for me. Asana, I think, is another great one. They have all sorts of different views to sort of organize your workflow. They have timelines, they have lists, they have boards. And so any different sort of view and perspective, I think, optimizes for different types of brains who can ingest information differently. So I really love that they're bringing those different products and different views of sort of task management and workflows to life. I think it's really powerful. I always get asked about why I include TikTok on here. You know, TikTok is not a very distracting platform. I mean, it distracts you from what you're doing, but it really engages you and sort of sucks you into watching the videos on the platform. If I think of something like YouTube, which, you know, if you watch a YouTube video on your computer, there's comments and there's sort of recommended videos on the side, and they have all these like pop-ups that occur to like and subscribe. TikTok is a very different type of video platform. So if I go to watch a video there, I can really focus on what people are posting rather than sort of the rest of what TikTok might want me to do. So I think that's really powerful. It's a lot less distracting, and a much easier viewing experience. Cool. So that concludes my whole talk, and I'd love to get into some questions now that we have plenty of time.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing all those insights, Trace. So it looks like there's a few questions that came in here throughout the presentation. So Anna asked, the terms accessibility and inclusive design are starting to blend the more I read about new trends. What's your opinion on how they differ or how they relate to each other?
Yeah, that's such a wonderful question, and something that I noticed too. I think it's a positive thing because it means that we're putting more attention onto both topics, which is great. You know, for so long they weren't thought about, and so now I love that they are becoming a part of our culture. You know, I just saw a job posting the other day. Google was hiring a designer specifically for an accessibility team. So, you know, those new types of things I think are really powerful. I think where they differ is I think inclusive design is a little bit higher level and includes, which is no pun intended, but different types of a broader spectrum than accessibility might include. I think accessibility, at least right now, how we define it in our industry, is a little bit more technical, and it's about providing access, right? Access to people who might not have access. And I think inclusion is about allowing a very, very broad spectrum of people who might have access, abilities to use products and digital products and services as well as other people. So I think, I mean, it's a fine line. Microsoft has a really wonderful sort of inclusive design 101 pamphlet you can download on their site. And there's, you know, if you Google accessible design 101, Google has a great resource as well.
Awesome. Another question here. Are there any systems or frameworks for evaluating design for neurodiversity like there is for accessibility?
Yeah, I believe that if there's a site, I might be getting the URL wrong, so please forgive me, but I think it's like accessibility.gov. There is a site where they sort of breaks down different accessibility guidelines, and on that site, they also have a little bit about inclusion. So that's a great place to look to see sort of how the government is thinking about how to standardize these things for public services. And then Microsoft also has a framework. Their framework helps you evaluate sort of how ability or how ability might vary based on people. So they go through a framework that talks about like temporary disabilities, momentary disabilities, and permanent disabilities. And I think they can help you understand things better too. But there's no like technical framework, sort of like accessibility. There's a couple sort of like code related or technical aspects. I'm not aware of any of those. If there is, I would love to see it. Clearly, there's a gap in my knowledge if there is. So if anyone knows it, please send it my way.
And John asked, do you find that clients are opening up to using the methods you mentioned?
Yeah, I think particularly method that I mentioned, clients respond really, really well to. They, it's a different way of making personas than a lot of clients have done, and a lot of times clients come with sort of like a pre-made persona that's very much made by a marketing or a sales team. So they include all that demographic data. And so when clients come with those sort of pre-made, I always take it as an opportunity to use the 3Ms method that I showed today, because it just gives a deeper level and another perspective. I think as far as, prioritizing edge cases is a tougher one. I found that it's more effective, like I spoke about, to include it into my design process and to try to propose edge cases as part of core workflows, rather than as edge cases. But that's definitely, I think, one that is a tougher sell, because it often requires more work or more effort from a team.
And Greg says, I'm on board with everything you shared, but how can I convince my boss and leadership team to prioritize this work? I feel like it often gets pushed down the priority list.
Yeah, it totally does. I think the one reason why I include that 34% is because I think that's a powerful metric to share, that 34% of your users are going to have a neurological difference or process information differently, and that's a really big percent, right? If you could say, I mean, and I don't know if you could really guarantee this, but if you could say, like, I could boost our sign up flow by 34% by making it a little bit more inclusive and accessible, I think that would raise a lot of eyebrows. So that's one way I think data really helps them. I think the other way just to do it is to start talking about it and start sharing, personal stories. I think a lot of people hide that the fact that they might be neurodiverse. They view it as sort of a weakness, and it is definitely, there's some stigma around it. The more that I talk about it, the more I tell people I'm dyslexic, the more that I share it, the more people come to me and talk about experiences they've had themselves, or experiences of a family member that are sort of in this larger bucket. And I think everyone is probably aware of someone and has a personal experience, as far as anecdotally, that's what I've heard. And so I think if you can relate to people there and help them understand or share personal stories, I think that can also help. I think at the end of the day, too, if your company is strapped for resources, like you're a startup, you don't have a ton of funding, and you're just trying to make it out the door, if you use sort of the softer methods that I explained, like forgiveness, and understanding personas correctly, I think you'll start making things more inclusive. You might not start making things more accessible unless you're thinking about, color contrast or eyes-free experiences or something like that, but you can start to just start thinking inclusively and designing inclusively out the gate.
And Ken asked, could you please give an example of how Grammarly implements forgiveness?
Yeah, let me go back to that little video. So to me, their whole product forgives you, right? So they have these little cards that come up on the side that show you your different mistakes. And so, an example of a less forgiving, like, word processor would be like Word doesn't really give you all of these really detailed, helpful suggestions and explanations around the writing that you've done and why it could be wrong. They just sort of give you like a red line that says this is incorrect. And so I think their user experience forgives users and then helps them correct their mistakes. And so it's very core to the whole user experience and like value proposition of the whole company. So that's how they do it. Like a very unforgiving word processing tool would not have any spell checking or grammar checking abilities at all. And so this is the totally other end of the spectrum where it's specifically for that use case and specifically to help you fix your mistakes. And so that's very forgiving.
And Gina says, so she used to work in digital accessibility, specifically with WCAG, and she was surprised to hear that you didn't think accessibility is inclusive to neurodiversity. And she was wondering if you could speak more to that and if you would include WCAG in that.
So I think it's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily leave it out, but I think that other fields or other topics inside of accessibility are a little bit more popular or more spoken about. You know, I would say that I don't find that there's a lot of standards around dyslexia or dysgraphia or ADHD. You know, there certainly are some, but they're just not as prioritized, I think, as other forms of accessibility or other topics in accessibility. It's something I'd love to talk more about. If you want to send me an email, I'd be very happy to share a little bit more of my thoughts in detail about it.
And then a few more questions here, Trace.
Yeah.
So Lynn asked, how do you balance the needs of different neurodiverse people, such as people with low vision versus people with dyslexia?
Yeah, it's very hard. I think understanding the types of people that are using your product and understanding your business objectives can help you do that. But even like the examples of companies that I gave here, you know, like for instance, I included Slack here, and I think they're really great. They offer a lot of different like color contrasting options, a lot of different options for like sound experiences or ways to like organize your channels. But I also think so while they do a good job there, I also think like their product can be very distracting and overwhelming, and so they don't necessarily do a good job there. So they do great in some areas and not so great in other areas. And I think it's a really tough, it's a really tough choice to make. But I think depending on sort of like the value proposition of your company, the type of work that you're doing, you can think about different types of users. And I think the more time you work on your product, the more resources you have, then the more you can scale up different efforts. So you might do a whole big sprint about like people with a low vision or an eyes-free experience for your application and improving that. And you might do a whole sprint on color contrasting options or something like that. So I think focusing different efforts of work is very important, and then also thinking about who's using your product and what their goals are and optimizing for that.
And then Jan asked, with most of my team working remotely now, we're doing a lot more video conference calls, and she wanted to get your advice if there was anything she should be doing to make these meetings more inclusive for neurodiverse team members.
Totally. I think, as the world moves more remotely in general, like after we all get out of lockdown, I think trying to not move too fast is very important, and not, if you're giving like a slide presentation or something, giving people optimal time to read and understand each slide is also really important. Like I'm super dyslexic and I read very slowly. And so when someone gives me a slide presentation over Zoom, I'm constantly asking them to stop and slow down. So I think slowing down and then checking in with people and making sure, that there's clarity about the topics that you're speaking on. I also think like Zoom or other platforms have really great like anonymous question asking capabilities. So I think encouraging people to like ask questions, but if they don't necessarily feel comfortable asking them publicly, giving them sort of another way to safely ask questions that they maybe missed or they were having a hard time with. I think also offering follow-ups, so if somebody is having a really hard time digesting information or participating for whatever reason, saying, after this meeting, I'm happy to spend a little bit more time with anyone and go through this again if you need it. And being very generous with your time that way can be very helpful.
And one last question here, Trace. Meg asked, as someone new to this, what's the best way to start including these practices into my own design process?
Yeah, I think the easiest way is to just do it yourself. You don't necessarily have to share it with your whole organization or your whole design team. Just thinking, the next time it's appropriate to make a persona, think about what methods to use, or the next time you're creating a workflow, can't ask yourself, can I make this more forgiving, or can I make it more can I optimize an edge case in here easily, thinking that way. I also think, reading more about it. So like I mentioned the Microsoft inclusive design site a couple of times. I think that is a great resource to educate yourself even more about this as well.